Good afternoon, it's Thursday. It's also Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, Megan, Melissa, and absolutely anyone else who has decided to watch this. I'm going to start off by saying I am a very happy person living a very privileged life. This is something that I'm not only aware, but also very thankful for. I'm thankful that I could wake up on a Wednesday morning, yes, referring to yesterday, and see my sister, whom I love, sleeping on the other end of the couch. I'm thankful that following this, I can sit up, go get some coffee, and eat an entire tube of cinnamon rolls, whilst watching a sitcom for 2 hours. I'm thankful that I live in a country where my family is safe, and we can gather together and eat turkey. Well, except for Megan, because she's a pescatarian, and Melissa, who is still working. I'm thankful that my faith doesn't cause people to tie me to terrorism. I'm thankful to be able to get my education and study what I want. I'm thankful that my biggest worries in life are the symbolism I tie to things that happen and whether or not people like me. I'm thankful that my concern for my life is whether I'll do something important with it, not whether or not I'll get to live it. What do you think, dang? These are all things that you really should be grateful for, but darn, it's random that you bring it up. Put a blanket statement over the above. I'm thankful I was born in Iowa and not in Syria. I don't spend a whole lot of time on Facebook, but when I do, I see the occasional article about the Syrian refugees. I see a status about how Oregon is accepting them, and I see statuses of people saying how glad they are that Iowa isn't. I am a strong believer in loving everyone despite their political views. I watch parts of the debates and read things online and have found that I actually like a lot of the candidates, both Democratic and Republican. I think they're all people trying to make the world a better place. There are two issues, however, I'm especially set on: foreign policy and immigration. The Syrian refugee crisis is something that I'm totally set to rant about, and intend to. But I think it's important to know that I spent a couple of hours researching first. Please note you can find all of my sources in the description, and I intend to cite things in in-text citation on the screen, with the magical appearing words. I'm not going to try and pretend to understand the great complexity that is Syria or their civil war, but I will try to convey that I've learned about it today, if only to help you all understand that it is very complicated. For starters, much like Sudan, when Syria was first formed and its political lines drawn, it encompassed very different people with very different beliefs. Amongst these people were Christians, Sunni Muslims, and the minority of Alawites. A society containing multiple ethnic backgrounds, faiths, and/or cultures is called a pluralistic society. A pluralistic society doesn't necessarily lead to political unrest, but in Syria, all of these groups were, and are, under the power of the Alawite minority under the rule of Assad. It's important to note here that original protests in Syria were not based solely off of religion, as Alawites are not a radical group. Many protests had more to do with the lack of political and economic reforms. Protests became more and more widespread, and the Syrian government responded by violently killing protesters. This spiraled out into a full civil war. Part of the military defected and became the Free Syrian Army. An important detail to understand here is that this war is most certainly not Side 1 versus Side 2.
Right, this is theatlantic.com. It was one of my sources, and it has this really nice visual on some of the things that are going on in This is the Atlantic. This is theatlantic.com. It was one of my sources for this, and it has this great visual on some of the things that are happening in Syria. It shows that there's a lot of fighting going on, and it's not a straightforward Side 1 versus Side 2. Up here, it talks about the civil war. It has the Syrian government and the rebels, backed by various countries on both sides. And then there is a religious war here, part of which including ISIS. And then you have the Alawites over here. And then you have a proxy war. And the major point here is being that it's all very complicated. There are 9 major identified groups fighting and over 130 smaller ones.
The part of this I will be focusing on today is the interaction between rebel groups, and notice I say groups rather than a single group, and an oppressive government. The Syrian civil war has killed more than 220,000 people, more than 8,000 of whom were children, and displaced half of the country's population. I'm going to take a second to remind you that 220,000 people aren't just bodies. They were family members. They were individuals with favorite colors and favorite foods and senses of humor and aspirations for lives that they are no longer living. I don't know that I've ever met 8,000 people, let alone 220,000. Life is so dangerous in Syria that life expectancy there has been cut by 20 years. I'm going to take a minute to go ahead and say that this is a vast oversimplification and a relatively minuscule collection of facts on Syria. My point here is not trying to give you all a certifiable education on it. My point, rather, is to remind you all that the reason they are refugees are leaving Syria and leaving Syria is because their lives there were more dangerous than likely any of us can imagine. Many of them pay thousands of dollars to be smuggled to Europe. I have never been smuggled anywhere, and I will guess that most of you haven't either. These people are risking their lives to try to make it to Europe. I've never risked my life for anything. I honestly hope all of you feel sympathy for these people, and I'm not under the impression that people who support keeping refugees out aren't sympathetic. The concern here isn't whether or not their leaving was really worth leaving. It's a concern that these individuals would conduct acts of terrorism in the United States. Politicians, family members, and Facebook users are worried about something like what happened in Paris, happening here in the US, or something like 9/11 happening again. First, it should be noted that the 9/11 hijackers were not refugees, nor formal immigrants, but in the United States on visas, which require much less rigorous background checks. It should also be noted that, due to their closer geographic location, France has had many Syrians that are seeking political asylum, a program that has its vetting done with the applicant in the country. Applicant vetting for refugees is done whilst the subjects are in another country and takes normally 1 to 2 years. I'm going to go back to something that I've heard before and actually agree with. We should tell these people, but we have to be cautious. Well, it turns out we actually are pretty cautious. All the refugees taken under consideration by the United States are first screened by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The UNHCR interviews applicants, digs into their lives and personal history, and searches for any of 45 categories for concern. They apply a very fine filter, and if there are any concerns with these flags, be they for safety reasons or otherwise, they don't move forward with resettlement. After UNHCR is done with all of this, they are recommended for resettlement, and the U.S. conducts their own investigations and interviews. Approximately half of applicants are dismissed by UNHCR, and from those 20,000 remaining, only about 1,900 have been accepted by the U.S. So far, the acceptance rate of Syrian immigrants is right at 4.75%. For reference, the acceptance rates to attend Harvard University is 5.9%. Well, to read all about it, so I have a link to my source in the description below. I've heard before that people would like to help the refugees, but that it's complicated and they don't want to endanger themselves or their families. Right off, I accept that it seems rational. And it's answers like that that make me realize how underutilized research is. In light of this, I'm going to help you all out. We're going to evaluate some risk. Since 2001, the United States has admitted 859,629 refugees. Of these, 3 have been convicted of attempted terrorism, all in foreign countries, and none successful. That is less than 4/10,000th of 1% have been convicted of any attempt of any act of terrorism. Based on this statistic, the odds of any given refugee hurting someone in the U.S. in an act of terrorism, even if we pretended that all 3 of the above cases were both successful, which they weren't, and were aimed at U.S. citizens, which they weren't, is 4/10,000th of 1%. By denying these refugees a chance based off of a 1 in 286,546 chance that they hurt someone through terrorism, you're in effect claiming that your life is 286,546 times more valuable than theirs. Moreover, this is true for any U.S. citizen, so not only are you claiming this about yourself, but asserting that any U.S. citizen is worth 250,000 times as much as someone born elsewhere. A common argument I see and hear is that the U.S. has to take care of its own people first. I mean, that sounds nice in context, but I guess I have to ask. Does my place of birth make me more valuable than someone born elsewhere? In conclusion, remember that just because people are born somewhere else, that they are still people. Have a happy holiday, all. And remember to be thankful for all that we have and often take for granted.